I will work day in and day out.
Wake up and smell the coffee.
The independence case is a powerful one.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated Podcast. As always, I'm your host Will, and in this episode I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Jenkins, CEO of the European Tourism Association and Chair of the European Tourism Alliance in the UK. Welcome to the podcast, Tom. So the first question I'd like to ask is, for those who haven't heard of your work with European Tourism Association, could you please explain what it does?
ETOA, which is the acronym under which we operate, was founded back in 1989 by a group of tour operators who were involved in the business of selling Europe as a destination throughout the world. In those days, they had Europe written on the front of their brochures, which was wrapped in agencies in North America, in Japan, in Canada, in Mexico and South America. And they were very concerned that there was a lot of legislative traffic that was impacting their business, but there was no representation for inbound tourists. Inbound tourists famously don't vote, and so their interests are broadly ignored by the destinations into which they go. And so we were set up. And since then, we've grown. We're now about, even after the trauma of COVID, we still have about 11 to 1,200 members, and we have representatives in a number of European countries. Our main secretariat base remains London, although we are now founded as our principal headquarters is Brussels, insofar as that's where the ETOA is now registered. And we continue to fight for the interests of inbound tourists. It has to be said, in the last 20 years, the notion of an inbound tourist has changed. We're no longer dominated by companies which sell with brochures saying Europe. A lot of our members are business-to-business intermediaries that sell to other businesses in origin markets such as China and Japan and Indonesia and India. But we also have a lot of people who are involved in intra-European traffic. So a number of the large online travel agents, for instance, are members of ETOA, and there are a number of tour operators who sell European product to European citizens. And I use the term Europe in the widest possible sense, the geographic sense rather than the political one.
Absolutely. It's recently been revealed that because of new entry requirements to the UK, that school visits from pupils from outside the UK coming to the UK have plummeted. How much of an impact do you think that this will have on the UK's soft power and reputation around the world, that school children who otherwise would have been able to come to the UK and visit it have unfortunately not been able to because of the new requirements?
Well, I think the thing to note is that this is an unwanted byproduct of the decision to stop people using ID cards to enter the UK. Up until the end of last year, European Union nationals and EMEA nationals were able to come into the UK using an ID card. Now, there may be virtues behind this decision, and it's not really for me to debate those virtues. What has happened is that the people who this is most radically affected are people who are children studying in schools. And most European countries, really, there is very little, not little, but there's a very minor uptake of passports, because passports are not required to travel throughout Europe. You can travel throughout Europe with an ID card. And this is particularly the case with children under the age of 18. And up until the end of last year, it was possible for a school group to arrive in this country with a teacher, having a full list and all details of the pupils in their charge, to come here. They would have to have a passport, but it was perfectly reasonable and indeed unremarkable for the group to arrive with proof of identity and proof of validity of residence in the country from which they came. Now, the decision to make everybody carry a passport has had a really dramatic impact, probably far more dramatic than was originally envisaged, because it's one thing to turn around to all the school children and say you've got to go and get a passport, which is both a considerable effort in terms of logistics and time and bureaucracy and of cost. I mean, passports vary in cost between 50 euros and 120 euros in Europe, so it's not a small charge. The main problem actually lies with the fact that the number of countries have lots of refugee and asylum seekers, residents in those countries, and the second generation children are not in a position yet to get a European passport. If they have to get a passport, they've got to go back to the country from which their parents came. And that involves returning to places which they fled from. It's very difficult to tell a Syrian person that they have to go back to Syria to get a passport off that regime in order for them to come to London. Not only do they need a passport, but having got a passport, they would then need a visa, which is now a very expensive and time-consuming prospect. So it effectively removes the ability of classes containing one or two or three second-generation immigrant children from coming to Europe, because you cannot turn around to a class and say, we're all going to Europe, we're all going to England on a school trip, but you three, you're not entitled to, because you don't belong here really. You're not welcome there. And in fact, it then permeates the whole school, because you cannot then have some classes going to Europe without any of these children, but banning others. So it becomes effectively a blanket ban in most of our source markets for school groups. So it's a very strange situation we find ourselves in. On one level, perfectly reasonable to tell children to get a passport if they want to go abroad. In practical terms, it's completely unreasonable, and it just doesn't work. And so we're seeing a 90%, in some sectors, a 90% decline in demand for these people. Now, in terms of, so I mean, the initial impact is going to be economic. A lot of language schools, a lot of communities, which up until now have hosted hundreds of thousands of school children coming to the UK, and they've hosted them largely in homes, and they've been dispersed throughout the UK. These people are not going to be there, and this is a real loss. So we've calculated that it's over over £1 billion worth of lost export income, so to speak, money flowing into this country over the 2 years that we're now looking at. I think the broader point, and it's well raised by you, is how this is going to affect us in the long term. The great virtue of hosting children in England at this stage of their development means that they form a bond with the United Kingdom, which they would not otherwise have, and it becomes not a second home, but somewhere which we hope they have happy memories of, and they feel very comfortable with coming to visit. And this is an enormously powerful hook to ensure that people come not just once, but 2, 3, 4, 5 times throughout their lives. And that is not going to be happening under the current system.
Do you think that there could be any potential political consequences in areas in which there has been this economic loss, as you point out, that there may be people in those areas who feel that this is a decision made by the government which has affected them, and as such it might impact the way that they think of the current government, and potentially how they feel in the run up to the next election?
Well, I mean, it may well be a political situation. It's very interesting that these rules don't just impact school children; they also impact young people wanting to come to England and attend language schools. Also come to England. England is actually a very popular destination for sporting excursions, where people come and play football, for example, and train to play football in England. All these, this industry really is very severely affected. And this industry is not totally, is largely concentrated in areas of the South Coast. And areas of the South Coast, as you would know from your political background, are slightly depressed communities now, which have traditionally been a conservative homeland, really. But now they're going to have a really tough time attracting the sort of business they had before COVID. It's going to be very, very difficult. So the language schools themselves are going to be facing real headwinds. What's curious is when you talk to people who have a dispersed language school program. So they have language schools in the UK, but they also have them in Ireland, and they also have them in Malta, and also have them in the Netherlands, which is a sort of semi-English as a first language destination. They have filled their requirement. They're completely full outside the UK. In the UK, they're really struggling. Yeah. So there's a massive displacement of business away from the UK to other destinations, and this is proving really problematic.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you've mentioned the impact of COVID on English as a second language skills on language skills, and that combined with this is really going to hurt them, isn't it? How much do you think politicians and the public are aware of language skills and also the enormous pressure that they're under at the moment?
Look, every industry thinks that people don't appreciate them and are broadly unaware of the impact that they have. I think at the moment, politicians are struggling with huge issues. I mean, we're recording this podcast the day after Jeremy Hunt's statement in the House of Commons. What amazes me sometimes is the fact that they are probably aware of the fact that this is having a damaging effect on English language schools. They seem to be unaware of the economic impact that this will have. Long-term, medium and long-term damage to Britain's soft power is not something that you worry about if your house is on fire. And the UK's economic house is burning at the moment. They're trying to put out fires. But it's extraordinary that we are in a situation where, whatever you think of Brexit, this banning school children was not on the Brexit schedule. And this is causing real harm. And we can ill afford to turn away the money that this represents. And we can ill afford to cause medium to long-term harm or a loss of opportunity that this represents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to turn now just to climate change and tourism, because they are somewhat interlinked. People understand that if you travel, then that's going to necessarily, if you travel in a particular way, have an impact on the climate. How best do you think we can ensure that people can still visit other countries, that there can still be tourism, but do it in a way that doesn't damage the climate, that is done in a climate-friendly way?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that we've got a problem here, and the number one problem is that consumers have got to start buying into climate responsibility. I'm not here to blame customers. I'm merely saying that if there is, even if there is a wide acceptance of the need to be more climate friendly or more sustainable, people tend to hang that up a little bit when they're choosing holidays. If I can use a lateral example, everyone talks about the growth of wellness holidays and how people are really interested in their health, and they will go to destinations which offer them all kinds of opportunities to improve their health and sense of well-being. That has not dented the overwhelming desire of Northern Europeans to go down to the Mediterranean and expose themselves to high levels of radiation with the consequent dangers of skin cancer. So, there is, and in such situations, it's a bit like, I don't know, adopting a health food diet while still chain smoking. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. Now, to get back to the climate change, it is widely attested and widely recognised that there is a climate emergency. We are signatories to the Glasgow Declaration on the fact that we recognise that this is a problem. As an association, I speak for ETOA, we are committed to cutting our carbon footprint, both in terms of our office operations and in terms of the events that we hold. Now, how can we get, and the members who are members of ETOA, it's not overwhelmingly the case, but a number of members are signing up to reduce their carbon footprint and do everything they can to ensure that their suppliers are doing so as well. So there is, as ever with these things, a huge top-down imperative to be seen to be doing things. But without an overwhelming, without this being number one priority for customers, it's going to be really tough to shift. Now, there are things we can do. There are things that it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to mitigate the carbon impact of an air flight. The only thing you can do is do offsetting, and this we encourage everyone to do. There is a huge impetus by those people involved in this area to ensure that people use the least impactful mode of transport. They consume the least impactful form of produce, and they don't behave in a fossil fuel extravagant way when they're there. But what I keep worrying about is that this is still a top-down initiative. People who will only buy products which are carbon virtuous, if I may use that phrase. But this is still a niche product for people for whom this is the sine qua non of their holiday choice. We've got to find a way of we're motivating and mobilizing industry, but it's got to have a reciprocal impulse from the consumer. Because without that reciprocal impulse from the consumer who buy what they want to buy, someone will supply it for them. And it's going to, so at the moment, it's a tough trading environment. I think it's just inevitable that we're going to end up in that zone. We've got to be more sustainable. We've got to be seen to be more sustainable. And I think it's just a question. It's a strange moment where the industry is ahead of the consumer game at this moment.
Absolutely. And in terms of when people are visiting different countries, you mentioned trying to encourage them to travel in the most carbon neutral way, or in a way that doesn't greatly affect the environment. And of course, part of that is infrastructure in different countries, trains being available, trams, alternative to cars being available for tourists. So how best do you think that organisations like the ETOA can encourage positive infrastructure developments around Europe, and how much do you think about infrastructure in countries across Europe?
Well, I mean, we use it. Infrastructure is used. I think there are a number of preconceptions that people have got to hang up. I think if you're looking at a truly not sustainable, but one of the least impactful modes of transport is probably a coach. It's got the highest, particularly if it's a tourist coach. Everybody in the commercial chain is striving to ensure that that coach is absolutely 100% full. Doesn't always succeed. But the coach is, everything in terms of the imperatives. Everyone is driving to maximise the load on that coach in a way that just doesn't occur at the moment on trains or on buses or on any other mode of transport. And you will find that the CO2 input per passenger kilometre on a modern tourist coach is a fraction of that of what you would see in a car, and it is less, I would have than a lot of trains. The train calculations, I think I would love to see a really thorough investigation of the carbon impact, the carbon output of trains, including that includes the cost of the infrastructure investment. It's one thing to say that trains are completely carbon neutral because they run on electricity which is derived from nuclear power plants or wind farms, but they then ignore the fact that you're pouring hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete all over the ground and manufacturing hundreds of tons of heavy metal that you're shifting about. So it's and the main point about trains is that trains are very rarely full in the same way that a tourism coach is. So I mean, I have perhaps a soft spot for tourist coaches, but they are extraordinarily efficient in their maximization of capacity, and I bewail destinations that block out their city centres to tourist coaches but open them up to cars. This is anti-environmental.
Absolutely. We've discussed COVID, we've touched upon it slightly, but to what extent do you think that COVID has permanently impacted or permanently changed the tourism industry?
I just don't know. So I'll say, look, you're asking me to what extent has COVID permanently changed the tourism industry? And the straightforward answer is I don't know. We just don't know at the moment. We're still in the situation where we had a massive inundation and the floodwaters have departed, and we're looking around the landscape to see what the damage is. How permanent that is open to question. I think the immediate problems that we've got with COVID are in terms of meeting demand. So demand is there. It hasn't impacted demand that much. The great rushing after small groups and the great outdoors and regional tourism, which is supposed to be coming on the back of COVID. There is some evidence for this occurring, but it's not that great. Most of the people who I have who sell the great bucket shop destinations of Europe, London, Paris, Amsterdam, Venice, Florence, Rome, they're selling and demand is flooding back for these products. And the big difficulties we've got as a result of COVID and the fact that 50 to 60% of the workforce that were working in the industry prior to 2020 had to be let go. There was no work for them to do, and they found quite reasonably alternative work, and it's proving very, very difficult throughout Europe to attract people back into work. It's not easy to attract people back into a job which you just laid them off from. And so there's a tough ask. It's particularly acute in the UK because the UK has decided to cut its talent pool from roughly 600 million people down to 60 million people. So that is, it's a real struggle in the UK to get the people that we need to do the jobs that we need done. So the extraordinary thing we've got is that we've got demand. We're really struggling to meet that demand. Now, will there be a longer term impact of this? I just don't know. The only area where there is possible potential for change, because from a leisure tourism point of view, which is what I'm really involved in, the demand patterns are reasserting themselves in the same way that they manifested themselves prior to 2020. The interesting question is, what is the demand pattern for business travel? Is the fact that people can do meetings by Zoom, not the same experience as meeting face to face, but it's a lot more efficient and a lot less expensive. So, what impact that has and how far business travel will recover and how it will recover is actually one of the big question marks about the tourism industry. Because be under no illusion, much leisure travel, particularly leisure travel that long-haul tourism is involved in, which is city tourism. The infrastructure for city tourism is actually developed and run for the business visitor in mind, and the leisure traveller sort of piggybacks on the core demand that stays in the hotels that business travel has sustained and built. Mm-hmm. So if business travel declines, then it's going to be a very interesting forward picture for the tourism industry. But if to go back to your original question and my original refusal to answer it, we simply don't know. We're rebuilding again. We're struggling to find people to do the jobs that need doing. Does that mean that we'll have to change the nature of the jobs that they do? Does it mean that we have to change the nature of the remuneration that they do, or the terms and conditions that they receive to do these jobs? All these questions are up in the air.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've come to the end of the podcast now, Tom. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. If people want to find out more about you or more about the ETOA, where should they go to find out more?
They can go to know more about ETOA. They should go to etoa.org. That's where our website is. And the Tourism Alliance also has a Tourism Alliance website, which is readily available through a search engine.
Fantastic. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
Not at all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.